that was fantastic.
Thank you.
Just crackly and alive and funny. And I just have this feeling that we're all going to go someday. We were here and we heard her read from it for the very first time. And I'm not exaggerating. I feel like the writer and subject have found like a really perfect meeting there. And so I had all these questions about some of my best friends, but I kind of want to go off script and go right to the mentorship book, if that's okay with you, because I feel like it's fresh in our minds. Yeah. Anyway, do you want to comment on all my compliments before we start?
I mean, that's thank you. That's the highest compliment. Like, I mean, alignment between writer and subject is, I think, it is something I strive for, but don't always myself feel. But when I sort of landed on and fleshed out the idea for this book, I mean, part of me was like, oh no, like this is going to be, now I have to write a memoir. Like that was never something I thought I would do. And I realized how personal the book would be and how deep into my own psyche I would have to go in order to sort of properly address the question of why am I like this? but that also sort of, that registered to me as a rightness. I was like, well, now I have to do it.
Right. So how did it, would you want to talk a little bit about how you hit on this subject and how maybe it grew out of the other book or how they relate? Because I do think with writers, we find our way to the next subject through the previous one usually.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think that there were two things in the writing of some of my best friends that kind of led me here. One of them was just that, one of them was kind of tapping into writing the personal in a new way. Like in some of my best friends, I envisioned it originally as a book that blended personal narrative and cultural criticism, but in practice, I kind of had to drag the memoir bits into that book, kicking and screaming. But
because you were uncomfortable with them, or?
Yeah, I think because that there was a sort of higher risk in writing about subjects like race and equity that like you just look like you're sort of exploiting yourself when you write about the personal.
I see.
And I also think that book has a very particular voice, and there is a way to make the personal work in that voice, but it was also limiting in a way. And the thing that I like when I finished the book, the thing that I was left with is this sort of stronger desire to write just sort of memoir full stop, which really surprised me. And I guess the other thing that kind of like the thematic things that Tough Love shares with some of my best friends is an interest in questions of access, of who gets who is allowed admission into certain rarefied worlds of writing, of publishing, of and I'm really interested in, I guess, how important mentorship is, but also how just wildly unregulated it is. How it can be
Absolutely.
like a, it's even good mentorship can be like a drop in the bucket because, it's just so selective in terms of who has access to it. Never mind all those ways that it can sort of, run off course.
And I think even good mentorships often do go awry and veer wildly off course. Like, how did you hit on mentorship though as a subject? Like, I know you said, you had this desire to write to write a memoir, write more personally, but why this specific thing? I really love the topic, as I've told you already, because I feel like it's kind of was lying there in plain sight. Like most of us have, not most of us, but many of us, I think there is an element of privilege to it, but we have experiences of mentorship, formal or informally, and but I don't think anyone's really thought to write a book about it, at least not that I've seen, not in the way that I just heard.
Yeah, I feel like because I've been sort of trying to assemble the mentorship canon for myself, and I feel like there are a lot of books about kind of single sort of book length, like Sigrid Nunez, Sempre Susan, about her relationship with Susan Sontag.
I love that book, yeah.
Yeah, and Daryl Pinkney's Come Back in September about Elizabeth Hardwick. So there's lots of like, this is my one mentor and I'm going to write a book about them. But I think the thing that sort of drew me to the subject was, it was like pattern recognition almost. Like I was reading the novel Virtue by Hermione Hobie, which is about this young writer who has an internship at a very toxic magazine. And I was like, haha, relatable. And I had sort of I registered in myself that like I have always been interested in that kind of relationship when it is represented on the page or on the screen. And then I think, I don't know, I sort of started assembling a little, I was like, oh, I've done this before. In fact, I've been doing it for my whole life. Yeah, I think it was a combination of sort of realizing the sorts of stories that I was attracted to. I was like, what is this telling me about myself? And then I just found the container.
Yeah, I really think you did. Something that interests me, I mean, from what I heard, is that I feel like a book like this, particularly in the climate in which we live, could sort of go one way where it's like the teacher is predatory, the teacher is taking advantage of the student, but you're very much talking about how the student is also getting things out of the relationship and is implicated and even has agency. I mean, obviously there is some predation going on there, but I think you really touched on the complexity of the dynamic, and I'm just wondering if you could talk about that.
Yeah, totally. I mean, mentorship, one of the sort of facets of it that I'm most interested in is how it is so deeply transactional, or can be so deeply transactional. And that chapter is very tricky because I don't, like, even as I am sort of exploring my own sort of agency in this relationship, I don't for a second want to look like I'm advocating for that. Mm-hmm. So it's sort of trying to thread the needle on like how do we, like, when we know we can get something out of a person that we need, that we know will sort of, make us who we want to be. First of all, why is that? Like, why is it such a common story? There are so many stories like that. And what does it tell us about the nature of mentorship itself, that something can be at the same time like deeply problematic but also incredibly formative and not like outside of any idiom of like trauma or victimization. Mm-hmm.
And where does the book go? Like, from, do you know yet? I mean, I know you're just in the early process, or in the early, part of the process here, but and that's a chapter from the early part of the book?
It's kind of, that's sort of in the middle.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. So I don't know where it goes from there yet.
Not that you should. I'm just curious.
I've been working backwards.
Yeah.
It was interesting to write that one first because that was a sort of, I sort of understood the narrative arc of that chapter most clearly. And I thought it would be interesting to start sort of in the middle of the book and sort of use that to find a lot of the voice and the concerns of it.
I have just one more question that I want to ask, I think, and then we'll open it up to the audience if you're cool with that. So I just want to ask a little bit about your relationship to the personal. You said you had this desire to, write a memoir after you wrote the last book, and the last book has personal elements in it, as you said, but it's a lot more cultural commentary and history than even what I just heard. I mean, if I'm comparing them. And there's this one essay in the book, for those of you who haven't read it, called Tiny White People, which is in part about the white gaze and about you learning to write, or any writer of color learning to write outside of it, and to sort of reckon with it as they write. And you say that as a young writer, you were a fan of Nabokov, who, to quote your essay, famously sneered at collectivity, morals, or group affiliation of any kind, and that you vowed to keep political out of your work. I guess this is about personal and politics. Personal is political, whatever. And I was just wondering if you could trace the arc from, like, vowing to keep politics and yourself. And, you said you were writing about, like, drunken divorcees in Connecticut and stuff as a young writer, things that had no relationship to the actual life that you had lived. And you didn't want to have politics, you didn't want to have the personal. So how did you get from there, which I understand you're an undergrad in this essay that you're writing about, to like a book that is pretty much inherently political, and then, we're talking about personal aspects that are political, and then moving on to just like pure personal almost. Yeah. I know that's kind of a tangled question I asked there.
That's a super interesting question. I feel like I did a lot of like overcorrecting in both directions before I was able to find a balance that felt sustainable to me. Like the really sort of the thing about writing about drunken divorced women in Connecticut.
That's my paraphrase,
no,
but more or
perfect.
Yeah.
Is that it just like the world felt so fully realized that I didn't even have to sort of, I could just sort of slip into it and feel like I was like my writing had sort of elevated by so many levels because it's such such an established set of tropes. But just sort of personally, it became sort of stifling and unsustainable very quickly to be like, I'm going to keep both the personal and the political out of my work entirely. And I think like that was sort of the first overcorrection. And the next one was like, well, I'm gonna, what happens if I do write personal essays about what it means to inhabit a certain subject position, because there's a real good market going on the internet for that kind of thing right now. And there was, and I felt like what happened was that editors were sort of too keen to draw that story out of me and have me write about, what it means to be a mixed race Black girl and how that's so hard because I always feel like I'm caught in between, like I just sort of found myself being edited to tell a story of a certain type of suffering that I didn't necessarily feel. So then I was like, okay, personal coming out again, never doing that. I'm going to write book reviews. That's it. I'm going to write criticism. And again, I was like, I felt drawn to the sorts of questions that I address in some of my best friends. And I had to find a voice to tell that story that, allowed me to express what I wanted to, but also didn't like conform to the sort of market pressures that are often expected from that kind of storytelling.
Yeah, like the trauma porn stuff.
Yeah.
And you did, and you did find that voice.
Thank you.
And now you're moving into more personal territory.
Yeah. I feel like that again, sort of, it's so funny to like just to kind of find yourself writing a book in a genre that you never thought you would work in, but it just, I was so compelled by this pattern in my life, this question of, why am I like this? Why have I learned to be like this? What about the world rewards this kind of behavior? And it felt like going deeply personal was the right tool for the job. It's the only way I can sort of do those questions justice in a real way. And I feel like, and I didn't feel this for the first book, but or I didn't feel it as much, but the idea of being scared of writing this book felt productive to me. I was like, that is a terror and a hesitancy that I need to run towards because I can tell there's something there.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about, did it feel thrilling? Did it feel frightening? But you just answered that.